All right, everybody. So since the last video, so last couple days, I laid the fiberglass on the roof and put the gel coat over it, which gave it this white color. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the process I did, but before I go any further, putting up fiberglass is something that I don't do very often. And every time I do it, I'm kind of figuring it out myself. So I don't consider myself any kind of expert on this, obviously. There's many free videos on YouTube of professionals who do this every day, who talk about how to do it. And I will link one of those videos, which I watched pretty extensively for this. So just keep that in mind. Don't take what I'm saying as any kind of authority. I'm just going to kind of go over the generalized process. But if you really want to do this on your own, kind of look at other sources and do some more research. Anyways, here we go. All right, so what I did here is I laid fiberglass over plywood. I think we all probably have heard about fiberglass, and I'm going to kind of go down and talk at a basic level. Fiberglass can probably most commonly be by itself. So for example, the high top on my van is made out of fiberglass. Now there is some wood reinforcement, but my understanding is that high top, the main structure itself, is fiberglass and was just made from layering, multiple layers of fiberglass together. Or you could put fiberglass over something. So putting fiberglass over plywood to waterproof it and to strengthen it is pretty common too, and that's what I did here. So this was a sizable project. I'll give you a little spoiler and say it actually went a little smoother this time than it had in the past, but still a big and kind of expensive project. And so why did I choose to use fiberglass on this one? Well, it was two parts. One, I wanted, a maintenance-free waterproof surface, which that will provide, but specific to the use of fiberglass is I wanted to use a substrate or use a product that would also provide a little bit of rigidity and strength to the plywood that I use underneath it. So to keep weight low and to ensure that I would be able to bend the plywood and get a nice curve as opposed to it kind of bunching up, as I used a real thin, I think it was like a 5 millimeter, so just under a 1/4 inch piece of plywood. And it was fine, worked out nice. But I noticed that in some, which I expected, but in some of the areas that are not as supported by the beams, both front to back or side to side, if you put your hands over it and pressed hard, there was a little bit of deflection. So what I chose to do is I laid just one layer of 1.5 ounce fiberglass mat, which I'll talk about the fiberglass and the way it comes, but this right here is what the 1.5 ounce fiberglass mat is. I basically just put one layer of that over the top and of course saturated it in the resin appropriately. And then on top of that, when that hardened up and cured, I rolled over a layer of gel coat, which is essentially, as I understand it, just a pigmented resin also. And that gave both the color, it gave a waterproof layer, and it added, even with just one layer of that fiberglass mat, a pretty surprising amount of rigidity to the rest of that plywood. So all of my goals worked out. Okay, so real quick. So fiberglass, speaking broadly, when we say fiberglass in a generic term, is made up of two things. It's made up of some sort of substrate. So it could be a fiberglass chop strand mat is what they would call this. A woven cloth, which is what this is. Or my understanding is, I don't have an example here, there's a hybrid that's a hybrid between the woven cloth and the mat. Typically, woven cloth would be used to add strength, and then the chop strand mat, which does add some strength, as we already talked about, but is typically layered over it to give it a more smooth and consistent texture and to build up material if you wanted to make the fiberglass thicker. That would be whether you're building, something in a mold like a top for a van, or if you're putting fiberglass over the top of this. So in my case, I just kept it simple. I prepared my surface, obviously made sure it was clean, sanded down any irregularities. I coated it with a base coat of fiberglass resin, and in this case I used the polyester resin. There's also an epoxy resin and an ester resin. I won't get into the differences between them, but polyester resin is typically a little less expensive, the least expensive of those three options, and works out fine for a project like this. But so it's very important to put down a base layer because the wood will absorb a lot of resin, okay? So I put down a base layer of polyester resin, which I just rolled it on with a paint roller. And then I let that cure for about an hour or two. And then I had already pre-cut my fiberglass mat. I laid it in position, and then you roll over that with resin, and you have to saturate the mat. And the mat will actually, it'll have a yellowish tinge compared to what it was, but the mat will absorb it all and become almost translucent, so you'll see the wood underneath. And that's kind of how you know that you have done it right. Now you have to work out the bubbles. Some people have like a little metal roller. I just found that if I worked it carefully with the roller, I could roll out all of those bubbles and other problems like that. Now, when you're working with the resin, all resins are going to use a hardener, and it's absolutely critical that you don't forget to put the hardener in. And that hardener is usually a MECP, methyl, or I don't even know. It's some chemical term. I don't remember what it, methyl, ethyl, ketone, something. But it's the hardener that you have to use for it. And typically most polyester resins call for adding 1 to 3% resin. And basically why you would use more or less resin is in less humid, colder climate, or I'm sorry, in more humid, colder climates. So basically when temperature is low and humidity is high, the resin is going to cure slower. And then obviously the reverse, if it's hot and dry, the resin is going to cure more rapidly. So typically, depending on your environmental conditions and your experience, you're going to adjust that ratio of resin or hardener to resin based on your circumstances. Now, as a novice, not doing this every single day, if I could give a tip to anybody, and this fiberglass job turned out really well, and I think the biggest key was choosing the appropriate time to lay the glass. Because once you mix that hardener, even if you do a lower percentage of hardener to resin, it's still going to eventually gel up. And if you're still working something and it starts to gel up and harden on you, you're in a world of trouble. You got to work really fast with fiberglass. And that can be very challenging for somebody like me, or probably many of you out there that don't do this as a profession. So in my case, I was very lucky because right now the temperatures are outside, and when I selected to do this was, it was roughly about 70 degrees, which that seems to be about the ideal temperature. Any colder, you can have problems with the fiberglass curing, or it will take a long time. And any hotter, it makes it very challenging as far as working time, I guess you would say. So, but I mean, there's a lot to doing this, and again, I'll reference that video down below. But my recommendations, just check that out. But this is just meant to kind of be an overview. Two more things I want to touch on. I'll touch on cost, which probably a lot of you ask, and one more final note on the gel coat. The gel coat, as I understand it, a lot of people, I think the proper term might be flow coat when it has a wax in it, which I'll talk about in a second, but is essentially a pigmented resin. So once you lay your glass, it's saturated, it cures for a short period of time. You can then roll on your gel coat, which is what you see here. That you also have to add a resin, but also the final coat of that gel coat, you have to add what's called wax. And I think it's actually a wax. And that will provide a tack-free, hard drying surface, because you'll notice that the fiberglass, it's just a hardener, or if you use just the gel coat without the wax, it will still be, even when it fully cures, it'll still be a little bit tacky. Now that's by design, so that way if you were to layer other stuff onto it, it's chemically and mechanically bonding appropriately. But when you do your final layer of gel coat, you want it smooth. So this worked out well for me. I think a lot of it was preparation, but probably the biggest factor was I had the absolute ideal environment for laying the fiberglass. Now you'll notice this has a little bit of a texture to it, and I was aware that that was going to turn out that way, and I kind of wanted it that way. I wanted a little bit of a texture to it. I think it looks nice, and you know, kind of hide some imperfections if you had it. And I just like the texture of it. So the idea is obviously the mat and all the resin, everything lays at the top. I taped off the edge, as you guys can probably recognize here, and I rolled a thin layer that overlapped over it of the resin. And then when I put the gel coat, I did the same thing. I did not roll the fiberglass mat over this edge, but what I will do is, let me grab an example piece of wood here. So I am going to go through and cut a thin piece of wood and put a piece of trim that will butt nice and evenly. Hope that comes in here. Let's zoom that in. That will come in real nice and even like that. So therefore it completes a nice waterproof seal. And then the wood, I'm sure most of you guys realize this, but the wood right now is unfinished, but I will put a finish on it, a real hardcore high-end finish that's made for like log homes, for like exposed cedar and log homes, or other exposed woods, and it will provide a waterproof, long-lasting finish on there. I think don't quote me on this, but I think the manufacturer recommends like a maintenance coat like every 7 to 10 years. So between the fiberglass roof, which should be essentially maintenance free, and then the nice coating on the outside, which will extend all the way to the bottom section, this thing will be well protected from the elements. But yeah, white. Why did I choose white? You know, it's neutral. Has a high albedo. It's going to reflect away the heat. I have two long, narrow, flexible solar panels, which I'll lay across it, so I think they'll break up the white a little bit. But yeah, I mean, overall, I was really happy. The process went really smooth. That obviously, it's important to have all the safety equipment. Sorry. You guys are probably wondering, well, one of the big downsides of fiberglass is it's expensive. So for this roof surface, which is sizable, I'll admit, it took 2 gallons of fiberglass resin, the polyester resin, and I've just bought that off Amazon. That's they were about $70 a gallon. I had to buy 2 sections of the fiberglass mat. That was about $40. The gel coat, I bought a gallon, but I probably only used about 2/3 of it for this. But that was like $120. And then, of course, you're going to have a bunch of consumables. Don't even think about trying to clean your rollers. Just buy new ones and throw them away. Paint tray liners, you know, stuff like that. So you're going to have some consumables. So, you know, you could see for a roof surface like this, it's a couple $100. But hopefully in the long run, it will provide a good maintenance-free coating on there. So sorry it's a little long-winded, guys, but there you go. Talk to you guys next time.